people who were considered righteous and godly, and they were not. They were imperfect. And these patterns are consistent, and these patterns are quite instructive.
You see these days, and this is not a new phenomenon, it's just, I guess you can go wider because of the internet, but the celebrity pastor leader. But throughout history, there have been others who've been charismatic leaders people have looked to, and sometimes they have fallen. And we've just seen a spell of that recently. We just lack sometimes the awareness that, like you said, and so I think it just directly speaks into our day.
Yes, I'm thinking of Mike Warnke all of a sudden, which was a name from the 70s and 80s, which is church history, but he had written a really vivid biography of involvement in satanic occult activities, even worse. And he was popular for his testimony. He was a comedian, so very charismatic, and people were awed. They were mysteriously looking into the occult for the first time. And then I guess part of it was not true. And when he was publicly called on it, there was the realization that he had embellished. And so I think afterwards people just wondered, well, what am I supposed to do with the fact that he impacted my life? How do I reject every good thing in every way that I'm different for the better now? And so, yes, leaders do fall. Medieval popes in particular, they didn't live up to their own standards of celibacy, for example. And we can be really hard on that era. But at the same time, there are people, and they are fallen, and suddenly the French Revolution comes to mind. Napoleon Bonaparte is a great, huge presence, but in the end, even he has a Waterloo.
I think when we see that kind of perspective, we don't discount even the work of God in our days among those who've fallen. I mean, when high profile pastors denounce the faith, even, we can realize that God works through faulty vessels. God worked through a donkey in the past. And I mean, God worked mightily through Martin Luther, for example, as we've talked about over and over, who wrote on the Jews and their lives, a substantial, piece that really contributed to the Holocaust, sadly. And I just think it's fascinating how God works through us imperfect vessels, and how he doesn't need us, but he works through us. And God doesn't stop that. That's not negated when somebody screws up.
I have a niece who named her first daughter Corey after Corey ten Boom, who is a great example of someone who lived among fallenness as a survivor of Ravensbrück concentration camp. And there's an example of church history impacting the present, as we might even name our children after some of these particular figures who stand against these particular patterns that we're talking about. But just suddenly came to mind as a little way church history can impact us in namesake.
You've done that right, Tony?
We have, our son is, I was going to name my son Titus Calvinger, Tony, and not for the sake of the Reformed doctrine. I just think his study of Scripture and his commitment to exegetical skills is just really important in church history. But we end up naming him Titus Sibbs after Richard Sibbs. And I think Richard Sibbs is one of the greatest, pastors in terms of shepherds of all of church history, and just such a great example that I think the more you study his life, the less you see those kind of concerns that you see in some other figures.
I have a friend who gave a middle name, Ambrose, to one of his sons. Ambrose, the church father, baptized Augustine, and that's cool. God has given all of your listeners that middle name slot for their kids to be able to provide a name from church history. So good for Anthony and Danielle for this, and that puts you, Tony, ahead of Ben in my church history book.
How do you think that, because this is a bigger picture question, how do you think the church of the past would view the church of today in terms of our ministry to children and to youth and to families and just being a church at large?
I like to believe that most church figures would be excited by the contemporary church, excited about children's ministries and youth groups. Historically, the church has not been able to afford that level of specialization. I think they would like Christian radio, and I think they'd like some Christian TV. Like us, they recognize the value of educating the young and seizing every opportunity to be able to preach the gospel or to be able to talk about God and share the values that are good for our lives. Church of the past might be surprised at the casual culture in our churches. It would be very foreign to them. Historically, Sunday was dedicated priority for families who devoted themselves to church. You know, you get dressed up because you're honoring God when you go to church. A contemporary worship would be a trip for them. I don't know if they'd get past the casual form to see the heart of the worship, or they wouldn't get past it very easily, because the outward form has historically been such an important expression of the inward heart. On the whole, Ben, I think that they would be quite excited, maybe even invigorated and satisfied by the creative things that the church is doing through media, through ministry, crossing borders, all of those great challenges that every generation has encountered. I think we do a lot of things well.
So as a last question then, are there any resources that you'd recommend for families, for church leaders working with young people, or really any of our listeners that might be benefiting from this conversation?
For kids, I'm thinking of two books. There's a Linda Finlayson, God's Timeline, the big book of church history. Second is Stephen J. Nichols, who, by the way, I should see, as well as both of your former profs this week at a conference in San Diego, along with Ned Bustard, The Church History ABCs, Augustine, and 25 other heroes of the faith that can tell church history stories to our kids. And they have lessons that are made really clear from the lives of the figures. And then for youth, I know of one book, Richard Hanela's Trial and Triumph, Stories from Church History. That's Trial and Triumph, which really represents history, doesn't it? The pros and cons, wins and losses, trial and triumph. But really for youth, like I said before, any church history book that has enough pictures to keep any person's attention, I think it can provide a great context. Growing up, my family had encyclopedias on the shelf, not just online. And I remember for hours just looking at the pictures and moving through them, and I read because of it in ways that some kids were not able to, I'm sure. Oddly enough, I think this podcast represents one of many types of podcasts that are available for families. I mean, this is family-oriented dialogue, and there are many resources available. I know that I'm sure Southern Seminary, y'all's alma mater, has this, but Covenant Seminary, mine, has free lectures online, and you can listen at the feet of some seminary professors, including church history, for example. But for youth, I'd recommend any church history book. They all are really pretty engaging. And every writer of history knows that you can't tell everything. So often there's a really good variety of cultures in particular. Asia and Africa receive attention in church histories now in ways that they didn't before. And so these are the types of resources that come to mind.
Yeah, those are helpful. I've seen some of those books. Tony, I think maybe you probably know a little bit more about them, but
we've been blessed to have some of those books in our house. So, especially the Church History A to Z book. Our kids love that book. I mean, we go through that over and over again.
And there's a series of ABCs. Movies, of course, there aren't near enough church history movies that are out there, but there are many, many good ones. When you think of Bonhoeffer, who didn't receive mention today, he's got a great story, and there's a decent movie around it. A movie like The Mission, where Robert De Niro seems to become a Christian. I mean, you'll see that in every De Niro movie. These don't have too much killing, and they're not bad for a family, and it ends with a Bible verse, for example. But it shows conflict within the church when slave traders come in to capture Indians who are Christians. Does a Jesuit priest fight against them, or does he stand passively in resistance against slave traders who are coming into the village. So there are, of course, lots of good movies related to church history. Luther, of course, is remade about 12 years ago, and it's fantastic.
And we've, for the past 2 years, have homeschooled our kids and have watched some of the Torchlighter series. Now, my wife has seen more of them with the kids. I've seen a little bit, but just trying to introduce some of those stories and, like I said, just the power of narrative, whatever form, is interesting to kids, and so it will grip their attention. So if, Dr. Shelton, if listeners want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
I blog now, and I'm not sure I like it, but I'm doing it, and it does get some attention. It gets some reward. www.brianshelton.com. So don't forget the W right there in front of brianshelton.com. There, I have written 3 books that will be seen, including the Apostles one, most recently. There's some scholarly articles that are mentioned there. A lot of your listeners won't be as interested in that. And then also, there is some recent speaks, and really for any time that I've spoken on a topic that's listed on the website, I'd be more than happy to share if that manuscript if someone were interested in the topic. But really, wbrianshelton.com, and that's very kind of you to ask where they might hear. I'm really excited about any way that I can help people to be able to understand theology and to appreciate church history. And so those values kind of inspired this website, and the blogs, of course, are going to have some church history in them because I love it. I think it's interesting. I think it's exciting, and I realize a lot of people don't think it's interesting and exciting. And I hope over the years I've become a better teacher, making it more relevant, maybe even more simple at times, so that the lessons could be inspirational for the faith. And that's really what all 3 of us want in our ministry work.
Yes, and I would just speak for Tony as well, but you're a good vehicle to deliver that. And I think you're an engaging communicator, and I love the Lord. And so I've browsed around on your website, and I would encourage you to get a hold of what you can from Dr. Shelton. So it was good to reconnect with you, and I think I saw you about 4 years ago. We were visiting Toccoa and kind of passed you at campus, but it was good to be able to actually have a conversation and talk about something that we all have vested interest in.
Yeah, it was good. And I definitely miss our conversations when I was doing rounds in security back in the day.
Yeah, I remember you wouldn't leave my office because you were so bored, and you were a great conversation partner. And of course, both of you were good students, and your wives were good students, and those were good days. They were days that were preparing us for these days, and these days prepare us for the next day. And all of us should remember that we're all a part of church history.
Well, thanks for the time today.
Thank you, and God bless.
Thanks so much to both of you, and thanks for your ministry and podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Theological Family Ministry Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please give us a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your friends on social media. All new episodes are available to listen to on Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, Spreaker, and iTunes. We hope you have a great week, and join us again every first and third Thursday.